By the end of 1920, the world was beginning to settle down once more after the dreadful carnage of 1914-18 and its aftermath. The majority of states put their faith in the League of Nations, arms limitation agreements, and the redrawn map of Europe as ways of preventing future conflict. In other countries, domestic conditions and dissatisfaction at the outcome of the peace treaties brought new forces to the surface. Russia had suffered 4 years' turmoil from 1917, years which had caused her people untold suffering. The Civil War finally ended in 1920. Lenin and his victorious followers were faced with the awesome task of putting their country back on its feet. The economy was in ruins. Many of its people were starving and mistrustful of the communist regime. The Western democracies were not willing to help because they viewed the regime as a threat to their stability. Indeed, Comintern had been set up in Moscow in 1919 to export revolution abroad. Russia had not been invited to join the League of Nations, and no member officially recognized her regime. She was thus an outcast. In early 1921, there were strikes in Petrograd and an uprising by the sailors at the Baltic Fleet base at Kronstadt. Their main complaint was the Bolshevik muzzling of other revolutionary groups and the lack of free speech. Leon Trotsky, Commissar for War, immediately sent troops into Kronstadt. The uprising was crushed, with most of the ringleaders being captured and shot. This was a dire warning that something must be done quickly before further trouble erupted. Lenin therefore introduced his new economic plan, designed to swing the mass of the people behind him by reinstating a degree of private enterprise. More immediately, he had to overcome the famine, which was now affecting some 30 million people. The peasants, instead of being made to hand their surplus crops over to the state, a policy which they bitterly resented, were now allowed to sell them on the open market. This was helped by growing sympathy in the West for the famine victims. Relief missions were sent to Russia and gave significant help. In 1924, Lenin, worn out and debilitated, died. His task of stabilizing the country by no means completed, with the economy still in tatters. Most people believed that Trotsky would succeed him. Joseph Stalin, secretary of the Communist Party and the mustached figure on the right, thought otherwise. He began a subtle and at times ruthless campaign to seize the reins of power for himself. Attitudes in the West towards Russia now began to slowly change, largely motivated by the potential trade markets which could be opened up. This was in spite of evidence that Russia's leaders were still bent on exporting the revolution abroad. It was, however, Germany which in 1922 first signed a cooperation pact with Russia, the Treaty of Rapallo. Apart from economic agreements, General Hans von Seeckt, head of the now small German army, engineered secret clauses which provided the Germans with military flying and tank facilities in Russia, both banned by the peace treaty, in return for training and advice for the Russian armed forces. Allowed as she was just horsed cavalry, these secret agreements were of immense benefit to Germany. By 1928, Stalin had, by one means or another, eradicated all opposition, apart from Trotsky. The following year, even he fell, when Stalin had him exiled. Yet Trotsky maintained a vociferous opposition to Stalin's policies, so much so that in 1940 he was murdered in Mexico by Stalin's agents. Trotsky's venom was mainly against Stalin's decision to forsake world revolution for socialism in one country. This meant that in order to protect the revolution against external threat, Russia must make herself economically and militarily strong. This was to demand enormous sacrifices from the Russian people. First to suffer were the peasants. Stalin confiscated their land and forced them into collectivization on the pretext that many were hoarding grain. The peasants tried to resist, destroying some 50% of their livestock in protest. Even so, within 10 years, most of the country had been collectivized. Those who stood in the way were killed or sent to the labor camps in Siberia. Millions of others died from famine caused by the upheaval. Stalin also introduced his first 5-year plan for developing Russian industry. He displayed the same ruthlessness in driving the workforce to achieve almost impossible production targets. Many were accused of being saboteurs and joined the rich peasants, the kulaks, in Siberia, where many perished in massive construction projects, like building a canal from the White Sea to the Baltic. Russia's armed forces also underwent a major transformation. In the early 1920s, the army was large in numbers, but had few modern weapons, and those that it did have were of foreign manufacture. Trotsky believed in a mass Marxist army with a small regular cadre, and that it should be geared to the offensive. Trotsky also argued for horsed cavalry, which had proved so successful in the Civil War. During the latter half of the 20s, the Red Army's doctrine changed. This was in spite of one of the senior commanders being Civil War cavalry leader Semyon Budyeni. First under Commissar for War Mikhail Frunze, and then under Chief of Staff Mikhail Tukhachevsky, growing emphasis was placed on mechanization, and this was harnessed to Stalin's first 5-year plan. The 5-year plan also applied to the Air Force, whose prime role was seen as support for the ground forces. Germany, too, experienced a rough ride during the 1920s and early 1930s. The immediate aftermath of the Great War had been civil conflict between the extreme left and right, with what were in effect private armies recruited from soldiers returning from the war. This had been brought under control by the center-left democratic government installed just before the end of the war, but the swingeing terms of the Peace of Versailles merely served to aggravate the situation. The severe limits placed on the German armed forces, with tanks, aircraft and heavy artillery being banned, meant that they were hardly capable of defending Germany's borders. Germany also had to pay crippling reparations for the material damage she had inflicted during 1914-18, payments of which soon resulted in galloping inflation. It was the right who initially made the running. In March 1920, a senior army officer and others attempted to overthrow the government. The army refused to support the latter, and the government fled from Weimar to Dresden. Only a general strike saved it, and the fact the communists tried to take advantage of the confusion to mount a coup of their own, one that was put down by the army. All this showed how weak the government was. Difficulties in paying the reparations eventually resulted in French troops occupying the Ruhr, Germany's main industrial region, in January 1923. The French occupation increased resentment and resulted in even more severe inflation. It rose from 7,000 marks to the dollar to 1 million by August. The government had offered passive resistance and had halted all reparations payments, but by August realized that it was impossible to resist the Allies without bringing total collapse to the economy. Reparations payments therefore resumed, and the French withdrew. Both extreme left and right saw this as another indicator of the Weimar government's weakness, and unrest continued. This was especially so in Bavaria, where the scars of the 1919 Civil War had allowed right-wing groups to flourish. Among these was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, led by Adolf Hitler, an ex-wartime corporal of Austrian parentage. His charisma and attacks on the indignities of Versailles soon gained him increasing support. Hitler attracted powerful allies, including no less than Erich von Ludendorff, former chief of staff of the German army. In November 1923, Hitler and Ludendorff attempted a putsch in Munich, with the eventual aim of overthrowing the Weimar government and tearing up the Treaty of Versailles. It misfired, and both Hitler and Ludendorff were put on trial. While Ludendorff was acquitted of high treason, Hitler was sentenced to 5 years' imprisonment in the fortress of Landsberg, outside Munich. Public sympathy for him in Bavaria helped to reduce the term to 9 months, which he spent writing his political testimony, Mein Kampf. When released, he was banned from public speaking. Much of Hitler's appeal was based on his use of the popular notion that Germany had been stabbed in the back at the end of the war by weak politicians, and that the German armies had not been defeated. Germany needed strong government to restore her fortunes. Intertwined with this was a racial theory that argued that the Aryans were superior to all other human races, especially Jews. Hitler's propaganda chief, Joseph Goebbels, helped to put this message across. In May 1924, Charles G. Dawes, director of the U.S. Bureau of the Budget, introduced a revised plan for paying reparations. This enabled the German economy to start recovering. In 1927, the last Allied occupation troops, a constant reminder that Germany had been vanquished in 1918, were withdrawn from the Rhine. This was as a result of Germany's admission to the League of Nations the previous year. Consequently, support for Hitler's Nazis waned. But in 1927, the ban on Hitler's public speaking was lifted, and he decided to pursue the parliamentary path to power. In the 1928 elections to the German parliament, the Reichstag, however, the Nazis won only 12 seats out of 491, an indication that the country was achieving greater stability. This was dashed by the October 1929 Wall Street crash, which affected Germany's delicate economy more than any other. Unemployment soared and served to polarize public opinion to the communists and Hitler's Nazis. Many jobless swelled the ranks of Hitler's private army, the brown-shirted SA. He was able to use this during the 1930 Reichstag elections to impress the electorate with the growing power and will of the Nazi Party. The elections themselves were marked by much violence between the brown shirts and their communist rivals. The result of the 1930 elections was that both Nazis and communists made significant gains, but not enough for either to form a government. In spring 1932, Hitler was in a strong enough position to run for the presidency of Germany and attracted over a third of the votes. This was no mean accomplishment, since his main rival was the now aged but much revered Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, who had been president since 1925 and now won a further term. The Reichstag elections of the same year confirmed the Nazis as the largest party, although they did not have an overall majority. Hitler would not countenance a coalition, and the Nazis continued their displays of strength, while fruitless inter-party negotiations continued. Events now moved fast. Von Hindenburg saw the only way out of the political impasse was to persuade Hitler to accept the chancellorship, which he did on the 30th of January 1933, although only 2 of his party were in the cabinet. A month later, there was a mysterious fire in the Reichstag, with a half-crazed Dutchman being blamed for it. Hitler accused the communists of being behind the fire and persuaded von Hindenburg to impose political restrictions on them. Despite the presidential decree, the Nazis still failed to gain an overall majority in another election held in March 1933. But Hitler got round this by using the Reichstag fire to arrest the communist deputies. All other political parties were subsequently banned. In August 1934, von Hindenburg died. Many Germans did not realize that his death removed the last restraints on the Nazis. Hitler assumed the presidency. His power was now total. Hitler was determined to rebuild Germany's armed forces, even though he was still bound by the restrictions of Versailles. First priority was the army, which was limited to 100,000 men. While it lacked modern weapons, the secret clauses in the 1922 Treaty of Rapallo had enabled key officers to study them. The Reichsheer, as it was called, represented a complete divorce from the Kaiser's army. Doctrine could be drawn up afresh to assimilate the lessons of the World War. Furthermore, every soldier in the army was hand-picked and trained to operate at 2 rank levels above that he held. This provided a framework for rapid expansion. Germany had no air force during the Weimar years, although the Allies did permit civil aircraft from 1922, which resulted in the formation of the state airline, Lufthansa, and the regeneration of the aircraft industry. Gliding clubs also helped to instill air-mindedness, although of most value was the opportunity to secretly train military pilots in Russia, as well as to use Russian facilities to investigate military aircraft design. Hitler now ordered the creation of an air force, the Luftwaffe, initially in secret. He put his henchman Hermann Göring, a great war fighter ace, as seen here, in charge. Military commanders naturally welcomed Hitler's expansion plans, but they became increasingly concerned by the role to be played by Hitler's brown shirts. The SA's leader, Ernst Röhm, argued that it should be at the forefront of Germany's military defense. Hitler also became suspicious of Röhm's motives. In June 1934, with the help of Heinrich Himmler and his black uniformed SS, Hitler swiftly arrested and executed the SA hierarchy. This confirmed the army's primacy, but there was a price to pay. all soldiers had to swear a personal oath of loyalty to Hitler himself. In the meantime, Hitler took Germany out of the League of Nations in October 1933 and increasingly signaled that, as far as he was concerned, the Versailles Treaty was dead. New internal forces also reshaped two of the victorious nations of 1914-18. Italy suffered from a series of weak coalition governments. As in other countries, the Russian Revolution inspired the left to foment a wave of strikes and seizure of land by peasants. This produced reaction from the right. In September 1919, a group led by nationalist poet and aviator Gabriele D'Annunzio seized and held for over a year the former Austrian port of Fiume, which had been given to Yugoslavia under the peace settlement. In northern Italy, war veteran and journalist Benito Mussolini organized what would become a mass right-wing movement, the fascists. In their early days, they were too nationalistic for most people's taste, but support for them soon grew. Mussolini worked hard to establish a power base in northern Italy. In August 1922, the government was unwilling to act firmly in the face of a general strike. Mussolini mobilized his black shirts and they marched on Rome. King Victor Emmanuel, fearful of a civil war, asked Mussolini to form a government. Mussolini moved quickly to stamp out all political opposition and assumed dictatorial powers. By 1928, his position was seemingly unassailable, with parliament appointed rather than elected and power firmly in the hands of the fascist Grand Council. Japan, too, was under strain. Rapid westernization, including universal suffrage in 1924, clashed with nationalism and her traditional feudal structure. This was encapsulated in her emperor, who continued to be revered as a god by his people. Japan was also experiencing a huge population explosion. Furthermore, Japan was also becoming increasingly aware of her lack of natural resources as her industrial base developed. The open spaces and natural resources of Chinese Manchuria, where there had been Japanese settlers since 1905, seemed to offer the solution. This was how right-wing Japanese army officers saw it. Part of the Japanese army was already stationed in southern Manchuria under the terms which had ended the war with Russia in 1905. In 1931, without informing their government, the leaders of the forces in Manchuria led their troops and seized the capital Mukden from the Chinese. They then overran the remainder of Manchuria. The Japanese now created the puppet state of Manchukuo. At its head they installed the last of China's Manchu emperors, Henry Puyi, deposed in 1911, giving him the trappings of state but no power. The naked aggression of the Japanese horrified the Western democracies, who were still bent on ridding the world of war. The matter was taken to the League of Nations at Geneva. The Japanese were roundly condemned.
I call on His Excellency, Mr. Matsuoka, delegate of Japan.
The assembly waited to see how the Japanese would respond.
Japan, however, finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
Then they walked out of the League building, never to return, leaving the other members bewildered at the realization that they were powerless to deal with a ruthless aggressor. Once the peace settlement had been finalized in 1919, Britain, France and America could concentrate on ensuring that 1914-18 was the war to end all war, and get on with winning the peace. The dark shadow of the sacrifices that they had made during the war would act as a constant spur. For Britain and France, the transition to peace was not easy. France's main industrial area, the northeast, was largely devastated, and she had suffered dreadful losses in manpower, as had Britain. Worse, the war had drained their financial coffers, and they were now in America's debt. The vast numbers of demobilized soldiers aggravated the problems of changing over from a war to a peacetime economy. There was much unemployment, as munitions factories were run down, and widespread strikes as falling orders pulled down wages. Britain's colonial responsibilities grew as a result of the war. She now took over the former German possessions in East Africa. She also had to look after the former Turkish territories of Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq in the Middle East. There was, however, a problem nearer to home. At Easter 1916, there had been an armed rising in Ireland's capital, Dublin. The participants wanted independence from Britain, by no means a new cry among sectors of the Irish population. The rebels took over the main post office, but lacked popular support and were shelled into submission. But this did not crush the desire for self-determination. This was especially after Republican candidates enjoyed considerable success in the 1918 British general election. Early in 1919, trouble broke out again, with attacks on policemen. Soon the British Army was drawn in, and a full-blown anti-guerrilla campaign developed. There was much Irish popular support for Republicans incarcerated in Dublin by the British. Atrocities were committed by both sides, especially by war-hardened auxiliary police volunteers, the so-called Black and Tans. A full-scale war in Ireland was not what war-weary Britain wanted, and eventually a compromise was reached and the troops withdrew. The 26 Irish counties in the south were given independence as the Irish Free State. The Irish leader, Eamon de Valera, pleased most of his people, but not all. Some felt that the whole of Ireland should have been made a republic. In 1921, civil war broke out between the Free Staters and the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. The government forces were left a large amount of British weapons and thus had the edge from the outset. Even so, the IRA continued to wage a bitter campaign. Fighting took place in the towns as the Free State Army exchanged shots with IRA gunmen. There was also much activity in the rural areas as Republican bands were hunted down. The IRA mounted numerous ambushes against Free State troops. Eventually, the IRA was worn down, and there was a ceasefire in May 1923. The IRA, with 13,000 of its members in jail, now went underground to continue the fight for an all-Ireland republic. Simultaneously, Britain's new responsibilities in the Middle East were causing severe overstretch, especially in Iraq. Arab tribes, freed from Turkish rule, used the Turkish defeat to try and gain more power for themselves. To control them was tying down an unacceptable number of British troops, but a solution was at hand. The part played by the strategic bomber in 1917-18 had given the Royal Air Force its independence from the Army and Navy, but bombing had little relevance in peacetime, and the two older services argued for the RAF's disbandment. Air Marshal Sir Hugh Trenchard, who had commanded the RAF's bombing force in France in 1918 and was now Chief of the Air Staff, produced a radical proposal which would safeguard the RAF's independence. He argued that air power could police the Middle East in a much more cost-effective way than having thousands of troops on the ground. The government, eager to save money, seized on this, and so the policy of air control was born. If a tribe was proving unruly, the RAF would drop warnings that it would bomb its villages. If this failed, a further warning would be given to evacuate a village within 24 hours, and the RAF would then bomb it. It did prove remarkably effective, with a few RAF armoured cars, which had been handed over by the Army, and local levies giving support on the ground. Air control was also used on the northwest frontier of India, which was the scene of constant skirmishes between the British-run Indian Army and unruly tribesmen. The operations on India's northern frontiers kept the army busy, as well as providing excellent training for the soldiers, both British and Indian. A further problem also began to surface in India in the 1920s. This was a demand for independence, which initially manifested itself in much rioting. Mahatma Gandhi, the bare-chested figure in the center, then developed a non-violent campaign of civil disobedience. At home, Britain's economic situation did not improve, and in 1926 there was a general strike. This threatened the very fabric of the country. In order to keep essential public utilities working, civilian volunteers were called in, and after 10 days, the strike collapsed. Matters were aggravated by the 1929 Wall Street crash, which resulted in millions being made unemployed. Defense spending was cut more and more to the bone, and in 1930, the armed forces had to take a 10% cut in pay. Britain was only able to enter and win the 1931 Schneider Trophy for high-performance float planes thanks to money put up by a patriotic philanthropist. This was as well, but the success of the Supermarine S-6B led directly to the development of the Spitfire, one of the outstanding fighters of World War II. France, too, was committed to additional overseas burdens as a result of the peace settlement, being granted the Mandate of Syria. She also had to cope with continuing unrest among the tribes of her North African possessions, of Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. There was also French Indochina, where the French retained the monarchies of the ancient kingdoms that made it up. In spite of their magnificence, though, they had no power, and, as in India, agitation for independence grew. France's economy, like that of Britain, never really recovered from the Great War. She experienced a series of right and left-wing governments. There was a good deal of civil unrest. What all the governments had in common was that never again could France afford another war like 1914-18. In order to provide an effective defense and deterrent, the concept evolved of constructing a line of fortifications along her vulnerable eastern frontier with Germany. By 1930, work had started on this massive project, which was called the Maginot Line, after André Maginot, the defense minister of the time, and who had been badly wounded at Verdun in 1916. In economic terms, the United States was undoubtedly the one winner of the Great War. The loans that she had made to her allies and the fact that she did not have to do much to reconvert war industry, which never really got properly underway, served to reinforce this. The experience of 1917-18, however, merely served to reinforce the traditional American belief that Europe was not a place to dabble in. Consequently, President Wilson, whose concept the League of Nations had been, was soundly defeated in the November 1920 presidential election, and America returned to isolationism. The 1920s in the United States were a boom time, when get rich quick was the cry. It was the Jazz Age. It was also the age of prohibition, when the sale of alcohol was made illegal. This, however, resulted in an illicit drink trade presided over by the gangsters. Men like Al Capone, seen here, built up enormous vice empires. Only in 1933, when America was once more allowed to drink, was gangsterism brought under control. By that time, the freneticism of the Jazz Age was long over. The ever larger financial bubble finally burst in October 1929, when the Wall Street money market collapsed. Overnight, many were made penniless, and many lost their jobs, as the resultant depression bit deep into the very fabric of the country. Only the election of President Franklin D. Roosevelt in November 1932 on his New Deal platform brought hope once more. He was determined to get the people back to work.
We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system, and it is up to you to support and make it work.
He set up the National Recovery Administration. Among its tasks was to mobilize the unemployed. With the help of the army, they were sent out to the more remote parts of the United States. Here they were set to work on massive public construction projects. It was a policy remarkably similar to that which would be used by Hitler to get the German economy back on its feet. Before long, the economy was picking up. The setting up of the League of Nations augured well for long-lasting global peace. Furthermore, during the winter of 1921-22, a naval conference was held in Washington, D.C. This set limits on warship size and the strengths of the major navies. In 1925, an international conference of jurists at The Hague in Holland drew up draft rules for air warfare, including prohibiting attacks on civilians. Further Geneva protocols on the conduct of warfare were also agreed. In 1925, the use of poison gas was banned, and in 1929 there was a further refinement of the very first Geneva Protocol of 1864, which covered the treatment of sick, wounded, and prisoners of war. There was too encouraging progress on the diplomatic front. In 1925, through the Locarno Treaties, Britain and Italy agreed to act as guarantors of Western Europe's national borders. Even more momentous was the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, when more than 60 nations pledged to outlaw war. All these attempts to eradicate war did not mean, however, that military thought stagnated. There were lessons to be drawn from the Great War, and military thinkers eagerly grasped these. It was the potential shown by the tank during the last half of the war which inspired two British military thinkers. While the tank's slow speed and mechanical unreliability had been drawbacks, modern technology was about to overcome these. Former Chief of Staff of the British Tank Corps, Colonel, later General J.F.C. Fuller, and war veteran Captain Basil Liddell Hart, argued that costly frontal attacks could be replaced by swiftly moving armored formations, striking deep to disrupt and paralyze the enemy's ability to fight. In Britain, an experimental tank force, largely based on these Vickers mediums, tried out concepts of armored warfare. The American tank designer, Walter J. Christie, developed a revolutionary suspension system which dramatically improved the tank's cross-country performance. But while the Americans produced some promising prototypes, there was, as in Britain, neither the political will, given the climate of disarmament, nor the money available to develop sizable tank forces. The French, too, carried out much experimentation. Among the tanks they developed was the massive Char B, at 32 tons, the largest tank of its day. It was, however, the dictatorships which really put the ideas of Fuller and Liddell Hart into practice. Hitler was quickly attracted by tanks, and soon the Germans were building up a large panzer force. Stalin was equally impressed, and by the mid-1930s, the Russian army had the largest tank force in the world, one whose efficiency impressed foreign observers. Theories of air warfare were influenced by the attempts at strategic bombing during the Great War. The pioneer air theorist was an Italian who was impressed by the Italian bomber operations against Austria. In 1921, General Giulio Due published a book, Command of the Air. Echoing General Smuts after the German air raids on London in 1917, he believed that aircraft in the future could bring an enemy state to its knees with little help from armies and navies by attacking the seat of government, industry, and the civil population. While his book was unknown outside Italy until the 1930s, his views were echoed by Britain's Air Marshal Trenchard, and this was the main driving force behind keeping the RAF as the only independent air force in the world at that time. Consequently, the RAF maintained a sizable bombing force. Trenchard recruited the British public's support for the RAF through the institution of air pageants. Thousands of people flocked to these to gaze in wonderment at the spectacular flying displays. Naval air power had also taken impressive steps forward during the Great War, especially in the ability of aircraft to fly off ships. By the end of the war, the aircraft carrier had been developed, enabling aircraft to both take off and land on it at sea. Restrictions on large warships, as agreed at the Washington Naval Conference, caused the major navies to convert battleships under construction to aircraft carriers. But in the early 1920s, the main role of naval air power was still reconnaissance. General Billy Mitchell, who had commanded the American Army Air Service in France in 1918, had other ideas. He believed that aircraft were capable of destroying warships and could defend America's coastline much more cost-effectively than the US Navy. He hoped that this might give America an independent air force like that of the British. In 1921, he was allowed to try out his ideas on some obsolete warships. He trained his pilots using dummy targets on dry land. Then, in July, came the demonstration itself, which was spectacularly successful. But hopes that he could immediately convert American defense thinking were not realized. Mitchell laid on another demonstration in September 1921. This was equally successful, as was another 2 years later. But all they did was to convince the US Navy that it must retain its own air arm. Even so, Mitchell's experiments were a chilling forecast of what would happen 20 years later. In 1930, though, cracks began to develop in the road to international disarmament. The London Naval Treaty of that year saw America, Britain, and Japan agree to limit their numbers of smaller warships in the same proportion as that agreed for capital ships in the 1922 Washington Treaty. France and Italy, though, could not agree and remained outside. The result was that navies began to break the rules laid down at Washington. By the mid-1930s, naval disarmament was in tatters. Then, in February 1932, the largest disarmament conference yet held was convened at Geneva. It ran until May 1934, but achieved nothing. France considered the proposals a threat to her security. Hitler warned that he would rearm if other nations did not reduce their military strength. Indeed, German rearmament had already started. Other nations, too, were increasing their military strength. Soon, very soon, there would be opportunities to try out the new weapons which they had developed.